We are going to study the Megillat Esther in preparation for Purim, both this week and next week. And the title of tonight's class is Esther and Mordechai as Jewish Leaders. And of course, since I named the class that, I wanted to add a parenthesis, which is Esther and Mordechai as reluctant Jewish leaders. Can anybody unmute themselves and tell us what it means to be a reluctant leader? And if you can give an example of this, please, if you want to point to an example.
Moses.
Yeah.
Okay, so Moshe, when Moses was appointed in the beginning of the book of Exodus to take the Jewish people out of Egypt, he demurred, and God spent a week debating and discussing with Moshe about getting him to assume the leadership role. Now, in one perspective, and we're not going to talk about Moshe too long, it's an unthinkable thing, because here the Jewish people were suffering. Moshe had been a champion for relieving the suffering of the Jewish people. And one would think that if the opportunity was presented to someone to heroically lead the Jewish people out of Egypt and relieve their suffering, which Moshe seemed very inclined to be very concerned about, why wouldn't he jump at the opportunity? So who wants to offer a reason why Moshe did not jump at the opportunity?
He didn't think he was capable.
He doesn't think he's capable. Okay. Then he points about speech defect and things like that. Is that what you said, capable?
Yes. Yeah, I can speak.
Okay. So, and what do we see nowadays? In other words, we see, I just want to mention that in the history of my interest in politics, I remember being unbelievably excited when Senator Lieberman was nominated to be vice president of the United States. And I actually happened to be, visiting with friends with Jeremy and Hilda Cohn in La Jolla, and the cameraman came in to film our reactions. We were on the news together about how exciting it was to think about a Jewish person being nominated to be vice president of the United States. So let me ask you a question. Was my attitude then consistent with Jewish values or not consistent with Jewish values? What do you think?
I think pride in other Jews is wonderful.
Okay. So I want to introduce a statement in Pirkei Avot, which I want to frame our discussion tonight with this. It's in chapter 1, Mishnah 10. And it talks about Shmaya and Avtalion being the two leaders of the Jewish people. And happens to be that they were leaders of the Jewish people just at the time when Herod, the Romans were ruling Jerusalem. At the end of the Hashmonai period, the Romans were taking charge of Jerusalem, and Herod became the ruler of the Jewish people. And they say in Pirkei Avos number 10, it says very clearly, it says a person should love work, ehov et hamalacha, usno et harabbanon, and a person should despise or hate positions of power. That's what it says in Pirkei Avot. I suspect if I would have quoted that, I probably wouldn't have been on the news that night. They would have immediately tried to find some other Jewish person who would be really excited. But let's understand, what is this idea in Pirkei Avot about hating a position of power? And again, I invite your participation here, please. Why would he be advising us that I'll read the whole thing. He says the following, this is the complete quote: Shmaya and Avtalion received the tradition from them, from the great people that were before them. Shmaya says, love work, despise positions of power, and do not become overly familiar with the government. Okay.
It could be that he's conflating positions of power with lack of humility. Many great tzaddikim have avoided at all costs being honored for
Okay.
their abilities. And
So
it could be that that's partly the reason.
And leadership does come with honor. There's no question about it, because you can't effectively lead. The idea of leading from behind, just to use a poor recent phrase, really is ineffective, because people are not willing to really embrace leadership, especially when the chips are down, when they feel as though the leader is somewhere hidden behind them. But what about also the idea of the corrupting influence of wielding power? Or even the idea that we're living in a world right now, all of us, where we are shaken by the notion that seemingly a despot is rattling his sabers and seeking a power grab over another country, and it's mystifying to us for some reason. And it's mystifying for us, even though we may come home from work having just, telling our spouse, hey, there were two guys up for promotion, me and Joe. And, the fact that I was able to complete that project 2 weeks early recently means that I get the promotion, and Joe is going to be working for me right now. So I don't want to muddy the waters too much and get too far afield. But I just want to also note the fact that it just occurred to me that that Shmaya, also living at the time when Herod first becomes the ruler, is when the Hashmonaim, when the heroes of Hanukkah were all wiped out, when Herod did that. But we know from Nachmanides, by Jewish tradition, that they were wiped out because they improperly, they were meant to be rulers, but they also seized the role of being the Kohen Gadol. One second, I'm doing it the opposite, I'm sorry. They were a family of Kohanim, the Hashmonaim. They were descendants of Matisyahu, who had been the Kohen Gadol. And when they became the kings over the Jewish people, they were violating a principle of Jewish tradition, which is that the king and the Kohanim cannot come from the same tribe. One is supposed to come from Judah, the kings, and the Kohanim are supposed to minister in the temple. And therefore, it could rightly be said that they were taking too much power into their own hands, and that became corrupting, and that led to their downfall. So we're going to discuss this idea tonight in terms of Purim. I want to begin, if we could, that Pirkei Avot was just a frame. But I want to point out what occurred to me. If you look at the structure of the United States, in terms of us, the Jewish people, we have a vice president of the United States today who's married to a Jewish person. We previously to this had a president of the United States whose daughter and son-in-law and grandchildren were practicing observant Jews. And if you go all the way back to President Clinton, his daughter converted to Judaism and married a Jewish person. So, I mean, the ironies abound in all of this when you think about the positions of the United States vis-a-vis standing by Israel and protecting Israel. So it's not so simple in one's own life to celebrate power. And that's what we're going to look at tonight. And we're going to look at it in an interesting way. If you have an Art Scroll Chumash here, our standard bearer here, if you turn to page 1252, they have the text of Megillat Esther there. We're not going to read too much from the text. This is an area which next week we're going to go to a much more famous area of the text. But if you turn to page 1254 and we take a look at chapter 2, sentences 10 and 11, I'll bring us up to date in the story. The story begins with Achashverosh ruling over basically the entire civilized world of 127 provinces, something I guess which maybe Putin is interested in matching. And there's intrigue in the palace, and the queen disobeys him, and the queen is killed, and he's looking for a new queen. And lo and behold, a Jewish woman named Esther is elevated to become queen. That's where we're up to in the stories. And at the same time, Haman, the villain of the story, is promoted to be the vizier to the king, second in command for the king. So we pick up the narrative in chapter 2. I'm sorry, it's right before Haman was elevated. I made a mistake there. Chapter 2, sentence 11. This is after Esther became queen. It says, every day Mordechai used to walk about in front of the court of the harem to find out about Esther's well-being and what would become of her. So Mordechai was Esther's uncle and protector, and he was very concerned when she was taken by force into the harem of the king who was seeking out a new queen. And she was being prepared for her encounter with the king, where the king was going to select one of these women to become his queen. Interestingly enough, commentaries explain here that Mordechai's keen interest in hovering around the palace and keeping exact track of how Esther was doing was because Mordechai had a premonition or a sign or an indication that if someone as righteous as Esther, who was hiding from being even taken in to be a candidate to be queen, she certainly wasn't seeking power, but the mere fact that she was found and brought to the palace and would be subjected to what she was to be subjected to, it occurred to Mordechai that this could only happen to such a righteous person if something very meaningful and great was in store vis-a-vis the Jewish people, which of course we know from the story of Purim is what takes place, that Esther heroically rescues the Jewish people from genocide. So chapter 2, sentence 11 is that Mordechai had this sense, it couldn't be that this righteous woman is going to be thrown into the harem and going to be a candidate to be the second lady of the empire, if not for the fact that Hashem has some special design in mind. But if you go to the sentence before, it says, Esther did not tell of her people or her kindred or background, for Mordechai had instructed her not to tell anything about her background. And the commentaries say there that Mordechai instructed her not to discuss her background and to refuse because that would arouse the suspicion that she came from very humble, maybe dishonorable background, and that perhaps she wasn't even qualified to be considered to be queen, and they would just send her home. That's one of the ideas. So let's just look at this now. We're finding a contradiction within Mordechai himself. Mordechai is doing everything he can to prevent Esther from becoming queen and to get her back home where she belongs. And at the same time, he has a premonition and an inclination, not a prophecy, but that if she was taken to the palace, it must be for some special reason that will ultimately help the Jewish people. Would somebody please unmute yourself and try to explain how Mordechai could act in this contradictory manner? Anybody have a theory or an explanation that they could share with us? Please. I think I'm going to have to.
I have a question. I had never heard before that Mordechai was doing everything he possibly could to prevent her from becoming queen. I hadn't heard that.
Well, there's a lot of Midrashim. There's indications in sentence 2 that she was hidden. They were looking for them. They had dragnets out for the girls. I mean, if you look even at the popular versions of the Megillah that have been made into films or stories, you will find that many women ran to the palace when the notice was put up that the king is looking for a new queen and saying, I want to be considered as a candidate. I would like nothing more. But the words for Esther was Vatilakach Esther, that she was dragged, so to speak, kicking and screaming to the palace. And one could imagine that a proper Jewish woman wouldn't be panting at the opportunity to become the spouse of a person like Ahasuerus, right? So it does fit in with the storyline and with the text, and there are nuances in the text that point this out.
But it seems you're suggesting that Mordechai attempted to keep her away from the palace.
Well, he instructed her not to say who she was. And there are other explanations, but the main explanation is because this way they would say, look, if we don't know who you are, we're not going to, here, just imagine the scene where hundreds of women are being brought to the palace to perhaps get the rare privilege of being queen. Most of them are excited, feel they're really in good fortune. And for example, it says that when they're prepared to go see the queen, this one asks for jewelry, this one gets special perfumes. Everyone prepares in a grandiose way. And if you read the text of the Megillah, it says, Esther said, don't give me anything. I don't want anything. I don't want the hairdresser. I don't want the makeup. I don't want the perfume. And she's brought before the king unadorned, so to speak. All this shows that she didn't see the opportunity to become married to Achashverosh and to live her life in the palace as being a great future for herself. Mordechai understood that also and tried to aid and abet her and gave her the advice not to say who she was, to discourage them from selecting her. And yet Mordechai at the same time kept hovering around the palace where he had good access to, because he was himself sort of a little officer in the realm, because he sensed there must be some good. If she becomes queen, it must be for a good reason. And as he tells her eventually, who knows if not to save the Jewish people, did all these circumstances come about, right? He's going to say that later in the Megillah. So I want to point out to you the following idea. And it's a big idea in Judaism, and I think it has an analogy to leadership, which we're going to study a little bit more in depth tonight. Mordechai understood that it was a disgrace to the Jewish people for a holy, righteous Jewish woman to spend her life as queen and amongst the harem of wives that a king such as Achashverosh would keep for the rest of his life. And therefore, it was something which he understood was not an opportunity. And his only desire was to protect her, which is what everyone's interest is in protecting someone from what is really an unhealthy situation. And he did try to protect her. And he gave her the best advice he could to help her get home safely and sound as quickly as possible. Yet at the same time, Mordechai had a belief and an understanding that, well, something is afoot here. And because normally God would have protected Esther himself and would have seen to it that she wouldn't find herself in these circumstances, especially given her nature, that of all the hundreds of women who were being taken to the king, she was the one, probably the one and only one who really didn't want to go. So I want to explain this idea that it's proper for a person not to sell out to their intuitions, but to see Judaism and Jewish values as a frame for living under all circumstances. So in other words, let's say tomorrow I get invited to a very special opportunity. And I think to myself, wow, if I meet all these people, I might be able to raise another $100 million to help Ukrainians and Ukrainian Jewish people who are caught in this fighting and get them food and shelter. That's a great thing to do. It's an important thing to do. Of course, for Pikuach Nefesh, we do a lot of things. But in order for me to do that, I have to go to a dinner and eat not kosher food. So that has to be weighed out. The ends don't justify the means, where I can say, well, I'm definitely going to do this. And there's complexity here, which I'm trying to avoid, but I'm not doing a very good job of it. What I want to say is this, that as Jewish people, we have our values and our way of life, and we believe that ultimately adhering to those values and adhering to that way of life is what keeps the Jewish people alive eternally. And as Tolstoy once wrote, the great irony of history is that the Jewish people who seem to be the least flexible in terms of their moral commitments, and everybody would think in a real politic world, we would have the least chance of surviving. We are the people that have survived through history. So even someone like Tolstoy made that observation about the Jewish people, that isn't it ironic? And we can apply this observation to Mordechai. So that's what I want to point out. Mordechai's sense of things was, wow, this could really be something important for the future of the Jewish people, but that's not my job. My job is to live a life of purity and holiness and live according to the Torah. Esther's job is the same thing. And being amongst the wives of a person like Achashverosh in the palace, even if she's the primary wife, and even if she's wearing the crown of the queen, is going to force her and compromise her and put her in a position where most likely her affiliation with the Jewish people will be destroyed, and therefore my duty is to protect her. So this is this balance. There's, on the one hand, he could see, wow, something's unfolding here, which is really amazing, and that will color his judgment, as we see later in the Megillah. At the other hand, he understood full well that it was a terrible thing for a woman like Esther to end up as a consort to a person like Achashverosh. You hear that? And that's where the sense of perhaps reluctance can come in. The sense that we don't go whole hog to amass power or amass grandeur, even though we understand, or amass wealth even, certainly by dubious means, even though we understand I could do great things with this power or this wealth or this honor, and my voice will be respected, and I could move the needle, and I could inspire millions perhaps to act differently or to act better. But ultimately, my job is defined by the Torah and constrained within the Torah, that when Shabbos comes around, I'm meant to be keeping Shabbos. When it comes to formulating a diet for myself, whatever diet I choose, it should be within the parameters of kashrut. All these ideas shape our life, and our belief and our understanding from the Torah is that's what gives the Jewish people their eternal nature and their eternal quality. And that's why we're still around. And that's ultimately what we're going to celebrate when it comes to Purim. So I want to flesh this out a little bit more by looking at a source that that I'm only recently familiar to, and it came from a lecture given by a woman whose name I knew I was going to forget right now, but from the OU. I think her name is Mrs. Shiowitz. But I want to use a source here, and this is the Book of Judges. And I just want to give a brief introduction. We'll talk for a few minutes about what happens in chapter 8 and 9 in the Book of Judges, and we're going to use that as a clear example to understand in a very vivid way why Mordechai and Esther would be reluctant Jewish leaders and why the story unfolds the way that it does. Okay? We'll pick up the narrative. The Book of Judges itself is described, and we have this also when we do the Book of Ruth and Shavuot. The period of Judges was a time when there was no centralized leadership for the Jewish people. And in a way, that could be a beautiful thing, right? In other words, we didn't have any Putins ruling over us. And therefore, as a people, we sort of fell apart, though, because we didn't have enough structure. And that's characterized by the phrase, everybody sat under their olive tree in their vineyard and did their own thing. But the sense of community and responsibility for one another and the sense of building up the Jewish people waned. It waxed and waned. It went up and down based on the quality of the judge and the ability to rally the people. And unfortunately, as we see throughout Jewish history, that primarily happened when the Jewish people were attacked from the outside. And when they were threatened from the outside, they tended to find a worthy judge and leader to rise up and lead them out of their quagmire. And then once the threat was removed, they tended to fall back into this more selfish, self-centered, less community-minded malaise, which ultimately provoked God to send another enemy against them. And that's sort of the waves and cycles of the Book of Judges. So I want to look at chapters 8 and 9. The judge who is highlighted here is Gidon. Gidon, and there's a lot to learn about him, a lot to say about him. I'm not an expert in him. But anyway, Gidon defeated the nation of Ammon when he came when the Jewish people pleaded with him to become their leader. And the Jewish people, in fact, enjoyed 40 years of respite without any problems. But here's what happened internally. Gidon was asked by the Jewish people in chapter 8. The Jewish people came to him and they said, Moshe Bonu, rule over us, chapter 8, sentence 22. The Jewish people said, look, it's been a good thing. You protected us. You defeated our enemies. Rule over us. And Gidon's answer was no, God will rule over us. Hashem yimshol bochem. We should be free people. You don't need a king. And this is obviously the whole period of Judges, which leads into the book of Kings, which comes afterwards. Not right afterwards, then comes, anyway, it's a book after. But Gideon turns the Jewish people down. Analogy, George Washington. After the Revolutionary War, there was a lot of people who pleaded with him to become our king. And he said, we didn't fight the Revolutionary War to have a king. And he agreed to be president of the United States, and he was for 8 years. And then he gave up being president, feeling as though those would be the normal limits, although there were not term limits at that point, normal limits of service. And I don't think there were any other presidents for longer than that period of time until Roosevelt. I think he was the only president who served more than 8 years. Enough with American history. So Gideon turns down the job. Chapter 9, interestingly enough, is that Gideon passes away, and Gideon has a son, and the son's name is Avimelech. And Avimelech means in Hebrew, my father, the king. That may not have been his actual name, but clearly that's the way this son thought of himself. My father was the king, and therefore I'm entitled to be the king. So if you look at chapter 9 in the book of Judges, you will see that this son of Avimelech talks the people into giving him the powers of the king. And then in not unusual fashion, he murders all of his brothers so that it's undisputed that he is the only remaining descendant from Gideon, and therefore he starts to rule. And he becomes a nasty leader of the Jewish people. Killing out his own brothers is considered one of those things. But lo and behold, there's one brother left, and the brother's name is Yotam. And Yotam is probably a play on words because it would mean orphan. So clearly Avimelech was the usurping son of Gideon, and Yotam is the one other remaining sibling descendant of Gideon. And he's going to stand up and try to stir the people and have them understand that appointing Avimelech as the king is not a good thing. And this is what he discusses. If you go to the book of Judges, chapter 9, and it begins in sentence 7, Yotam gets up and he gives a powerful speech. And we'll do this outside because we don't need to look at all the details. But Yotam says, I'm going to tell you a story. And he's speaking to the entire Jewish people here. And let's listen to his story. It has many layers of meaning. And we're going to look at it from one direction, but you're free to think about it in other directions as well. He says, let's imagine that all the trees decide together that they want a tree to rule over them. He's telling a story, a parable. So what do the trees do? So he says the trees all go to the olive tree. And the olive tree is in many ways the most grand tree of all. And ironically, of course, we use olive oil to anoint the kings of the Jewish people. And to anoint Mashiach means someone anointed in oil. So they go to the olive tree and they say, olive tree, rule over us. We're ready. We prostrate ourselves before you. We want you to rule over us. What does the olive tree say? The olive tree says, I don't want to do that. I'm busy giving to the world. I'm busy providing olives and oil. I'm giving people the opportunity to honor themselves, ultimately to enjoy the products of my life. Leave me alone. I don't want to rule over you. Then the trees go to the fig tree, one step down. And they say to the fig tree, we're here, we prostrate ourselves before you. We want you to rule over us. And the fig tree says, I'm producing sweet fruit that brings joy to life, that makes life sweeter for all of us, not just for myself. Why would I give up that role to become the leader? And then they go to the grapevine and they say to the grapevine, you rule over us. And the grapevine says something similar. The grapevine says, look, my fruit gladdens Hashem and gladdens the hearts of human beings. Leave me alone. I'm busy doing great things. And what I would add parenthetically, each tree is saying, I'm busy contributing to the good of everyone and adding value to society. I'm not willing to give up that position for the power that you want to offer me. And we're doing it through the matrix of Avot, chapter 1, number 10, where it says, despise power. So now the trees are getting stuck. So what do they finally do? They go to the thorn bush. They end up by a thorn tree, which has thorns, which doesn't even give shade. And they say to the thorn tree, rule over us. And the tree sort of says, interestingly enough, you want me to reign over you? If you honestly want me to do that, okay, I'll do it. And you can take shelter in my shade. Now, obviously, there's no shade to take shelter in. There's a little something funny here. But then the thorn bush warns the people, warns the other trees and says, understand something. If you give me this power and then you try to take it away from me, a fire will come forth from my thorns. And that fire will be so hot and so powerful that it will consume the cedars of Lebanon. This is the end of the allegory. And as you can imagine, it doesn't go well. Yotam is able to inspire people. People rebel against Avimelech, the son of Gidon, who is pretentious to be king. He defeats them in battle. They ultimately defeat him in battle. Then he's wiping out his enemies, literally eliminating his enemies one at a time. Comes to a city where they gather in a tower. He's ready to burn the entire tower and kill all the people inside it. And a woman throws down some kind of utensil from the top of the tower. It hits him, it wounds him mortally. He says to his standard bearer, to the youth who manages his weapons, kill me, because I don't want it to be said that a woman's might caused me to die. His standard bearer kills him. And that's the end of this sad chapter for the Jewish people. There's many ways you could read this, but I want to read it two ways, and that which will illustrate our theme. On the one hand, I can read it exactly as coming out of the mouth of Shemaiah. Love work, despise positions of power, don't even become connected to the rulers. Stay away from them. Do good, build up the community, contribute everything you can for your well-being and the well-being for others, and stay the task. Don't seek out a position of power. But then if we go to chapter 2 in Pirkei Avot, and you come to Mishnah 5, where Hillel says, very dramatically, Bimkom she'ein anashim, hishtadel liot ish. In a place where there are no men, you have to step forward and you have to make every effort to be the man. So in a certain sense, the parable given by Yotam has two aspects to it that are important to think about. Number one, if you want power for power's sake, and if you see yourself as, well, my father was a great man, he did a great turn for the Jewish people, they owe me, they owe him, they owe his memory, I'm seizing his legacy for my own benefit, and I'm ready to rule, even though maybe my intentions to rule are not so harsh at the beginning, such a person is going to end up creating great travesties and is going to end up creating great destruction. By the same token, perhaps had the olive tree stepped forward and said, look, I'm producing great fruits. I'm contributing to the well-being of the world. I don't want the power. I don't want the glory. I don't want the honor. But to the extent that I see that society needs leadership, I'm willing to undertake to be a leader only to the extent that's necessary and only to the extent that I see myself remaining true to my values and to my standards. And of course, it's very, very hard, if not impossible, for anyone to manage that balance, for anyone to stand balanced between the advice of Shemaiah to hate power And yet the directive of Hillel, that when you see your leadership is needed, you have a responsibility to step into the breach and be a leader to the extent possible. And I want to read a comment by the Tiferet Yisrael, a commentary on the Mishnah when it comes to Hillel's statement that when you see there are no leaders, I'm using the word leaders for the word anoshim, then you need to endeavor to be one. So he adds the following thought. When you see in your generation people going astray, society crumbling, and that there's no voice to redirect people and to have people step up to the responsibilities. And he adds, you sense within yourself that God is pulling at me and almost reaching out to me to take on responsibility for others, even though it comes with power, even though it comes with prestige, even though it comes with honor. At such a moment, a person has to work first to strengthen yourself in trust of God and to feel as though that you're ultimately a servant of God. And then once a person goes through that internal exercise, then he can step forward and he can exert power and authority to the extent necessary for the betterment of society. I think this is a beautiful study in reluctant leadership. I don't think we come across it very often. I think, unfortunately, the history of the world is replete with people who may have been sincere, may have had the best of intentions at a certain point in their life, or may even have shunned all power and yet ultimately become tyrants and people that cause tremendous destruction, and people who become like the Avimelech in the book of Judges in chapter 9, who feel as though everybody owes a debt of gratitude to my family for what my father did, and I'm going to exact that debt of gratitude from them, whether they like it or not. I think that this paints a picture of insight and understanding to a Jewish view of leadership. I think it gives us insight into the dialogue between Moshe and Hashem at the burning bush and for the days after. And it shows as well that from the Torah's viewpoint and the Jewish people's viewpoint, we do best with reluctant leaders rather than people who feel as though it's my job to make the world right and that I'm going to act in place of God. Happy to answer any questions. And then next week, I hope to go on and to discuss the Megillah, the turning point in the Megillah, which we will relate directly to this wonderful picture of my grandson. And the sentence there is, "B'layla hu nodada shnas hamelech," that on that incredible night, the king's sleep was disturbed. This would be a picture of the king just before his sleep became disturbed. Happy to answer any questions on what we talked about tonight, if there are any. And if not, we'll let sleeping children lie, and we'll look forward to discussing the Megillah again next week. Everyone should have a great week. And, let's all get in the Purim spirit and be ready to really celebrate on Wednesday night next week and Thursday when we celebrate the holiday of Purim. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.